Introduction to Adolescence, Part 3, Theoretical Perspectives. Adolescent experts, they tend to disagree quite a bit on how important biological change is when we define adolescence. So based on this aspect alone, theorists pretty much range from extremely biological to extremely environmental, and we're really just going right back to that good old nature versus nurture debate. So let's look at a couple of examples. We're going to start on that extremely biological side, or more accurately, we're going to call it biosocial view of adolescence. And the biosocial view of adolescence stresses that hormonal and physical changes, like the puberty basically, are the driving force of defining adolescence. The most prominent biosocial theorist is G. Stanley Hall. We will talk about Hall a few more times in this class because he's really considered the father of the scientific study of adolescence. Hall had this idea that development of an adolescent paralleled the development of the human species. So, the most important legacy of Hall's view is really the belief that there's this inevitable period of what he called storm and stress. So this is these hormonal changes that happen in puberty, and they basically cause this huge upheaval for both the individual that experiences them and then the people that are around them. And we see this being perpetuated in a lot of books. If you go to the library and you look up adolescence, you're going to find survival kits for parents, like these survival books that really take on this idea about how it's hormones, and it's going to cause all of these problems. Well, the good news is that scientists don't really believe that adolescence is inherently problematic. And they also don't believe that these hormones that occur during puberty by themselves are what cause emotional problems. A lot of the more contemporary work looks at emotional problems, looks at biological factors, that's what I meant, and how these biological factors shape adolescent experience. There's been a lot of recent advances in neuroscience specifically related to adolescence, and one of which stresses that the anatomy and activity of the brain in an adolescent, this is called the dual system or the maturational imbalance theory. They say that there's this simultaneous development of two different brain systems. One brain system governs the way in which they process rewards, punishment, social and emotional information, and then the other one regulates self-control, planning, logical reasoning, things like that. Next, let's go into the organismic viewpoint. So these are like biosocial theorists, but they do recognize that importance of the biological changes, but they also take into account the way in which contextual forces interacts and modifies the biological forces. There's three really important theorists here, and you might recognize all three of these names. The first one is Freud. He said that the psychosexual conflict that arises at different points in development, generally we're speaking that latency genital stage. So if you recall Freud's psychosexual stages, you'll know that the latency stage was kind of a period of rest between the phallic stage and the genital stage, in which the child is developing in other ways other than sexually, like going to school. But the reason that Freud built in the latency stage was because he said that the phallic stage was so stressful for a child that they kind of needed that break. So going into that genital stage, we're looking at these unconscious sexual urges starting to develop. Erik Erikson, whose work was really built on Freud's psychosexual stages, but he developed psychosocial stages of development. He also believed that internal biological development really moves the individual from one developmental stage to the next. But unlike Freud's theories, he stressed the psychosocial rather than psychosexual conflicts. So he called these crises, and he thought that in adolescence, the main crisis was identity. So can they find their own identity, or will they go through role confusion? And then the third is Jean Piaget. Piaget, best understood through his cognitive developmental stages, Piaget really thought that that there's like a change in the way that a child thinks in adolescence. So he thought as children mature, they pass through these distinct stages, and in adolescence, they're going from the concrete operational into the formal operations stage. So they're beginning to think more concretely. They're beginning to think about hypotheticals, abstract thoughts, so on and so forth. In the middle of there, you will see Skinner's behaviorism and Bandura's social learning theory, and both of those are learning theorists. Learning theorists stress the context in which the behavior takes place. So learning theorists have very little to say about adolescence as developmental period because they kind of assume that there's this basic process for human behavior that's the same during adolescence as it is during any other part in the lifespan. And one group of behaviorists, Skinner, emphasizes this process of reinforcement and punishment. You might know it as operant conditioning. And he thought that this was the main influence on adolescent behavior. So when an adolescent is rewarded or reinforced, they will do that behavior again, and when they're punished, they will not. On a related approach, social learning theorists like Albert Bandura, who did the Bobo doll experiment, they place a little bit more weight on the processes of observational learning and imitation. The sociological theorists, they really kind of try to understand how adolescents as a group come to age in society. So instead of emphasizing individual differences in biological makeup or their individual experiences, they really focus on things that all adolescents as a group kind of have in common. Two themes have really dominated this discussion. One theme is concerning adolescent marginality, which emphasizes the difference in power that exists between adults and adolescents. And then the other is more concerns itself with this intergenerational conflict. Adolescents really grow up in a different time. It's different social circumstances and a lot of different cultural things that are happening around them. And thus they develop different sets of attitudes, values, beliefs, which inevitably creates tension between adults and adolescents. And we see this in pop culture right now on TikTok with Gen Z versus millennials. We used to see it millennials versus Gen X, and before that we saw Gen X versus boomers. And so we constantly will see that parent-child kind of relationship have that dichotomy and then those differences. And then on the very far end, we're looking at historical and anthropological viewpoints or perspectives. So like sociological psychologists, historians and anthropologists who study adolescence, they share an interest in the broader context in which young people kind of come of age, but the historical perspective stresses adolescence as this developmental period that varies considerably from one historical era to another. One group of theorists has taken this viewpoint to the extreme, saying that adolescence is entirely a social invention. So without us calling it adolescence, there really isn't an adolescent developmental time. Anthropologists believe that the way which we divide life cycles into stages, like drawing boundaries between childhood and adolescence, for example, there's nothing more than a reflection of political, economic, and social circumstances in which we live. These type of thinkers view adolescence as like a culturally defined experiences. So if it's stressful and difficult in one society and the society sees adolescence in this way, then that's how it's going to be. But if another society sees it as like a calm and peaceful transition into adulthood, then that's how they see it. And so we have these alternative visions. And that concludes this video.